Just prior to Christmas last year, I was asked by Howard Smith of the Model Centre if I'd make a few modifications, alterations, details, weathering on one of Hornby's latest 9Fs in the manifestation of the preserved Black Prince, preserved by David Shepherd in the late 60s. Now, the Model Centre had loads of these for sale, and they did a marvellous discount. And the idea was that I would do this little promo and they'd sell more. Well, I'm still going to do the promo, but it's no longer necessary. They've all sold out. However, don't worry, because this model is still available, and I have to say, a magnificent model. It's in as preserved condition. With all that bright work? Well, maybe. It's remarkable that this locomotive has been preserved now, the real one, for almost 60 years. And its BR life, amazingly, was about 1/6 of what was expected. It's run on preserved lines, and for a time it actually ran on the main lines, on specials, but there's a ban now on locomotives with non-flanged wheels, and the centre one, correctly, prototypically, is non-flanged. So this can only run now on preserved lines, and I think its boiler ticket has now expired. But it is a lovely model, so let's see how I got on. A little bit of history first. The model above is Hornby's first 9F, tender drive with battleship valve gear. It made a lot of noise, pulled a house brick, and sometimes the valve gear jammed up. But at the time, it was the only available RTR 9F. Now, in their wisdom, Hornby decided that the battleship valve gear and the rather gross wheels could be improved, still keeping the tender drive, and so they brought out this improved chassis block. Improved in appearance, but very sadly it suffered from metal cancer, and if you look closely on this you can see elements of that which are crumbling away. But there was nothing wrong with the body, and so what I did with this one is throw the old chassis away, or find a guy with a white stick and a dog and give it to him, and hope he doesn't notice. Can I say that? We'll see. What I did then is build a Comet chassis, this time Loco drive of course, and a Comet chassis for the tender, and it makes a remarkably accurate 9F. Eventually Hornby decided that tender drive really wasn't up to the job, so they brought out this much improved Loco drive, but in the railroad range. And by that I mean it was sort of cheaper, not cheap, better value should we say, Loco drive, but it still didn't have things like brakes, but a good improvement. And a few years ago I took this model and changed it from Evening Star, a glossy, shiny, well cared for Evening Star, and turned it into a rather grubby, though more typical 9F, but still with no brakes. And now we come to the latest manifestation from Hornby, or one of the latest manifestations, in the form of 92167, which was one of the trio fitted with a Berkeley, or Berkeley if you're an American, mechanical stoker. And this is a magnificent model. The best 9F? That's debatable, especially with Jeff Haynes' wonderful weathering. And here's what I've done to what was Black Prince. Now, to the purist, the collector say, they'll be throwing their arms up in horror. You ruined it, you swine. You've taken all the gloss off. You've changed its number. You've detailed it. And don't tell me you've thrown away the box. Afraid so. Add a crew, bit of weathering, little bit of detailing, and this is a much more typical 9F, and I think more realistic, and certainly in general BR grime condition. Always consult prototype pictures. Now my weathering is little more than a mixture of matte black, leather, matte white, dark grey, Humbrol enamels. And how I did this is in the latest issue of BRM, or the issue before the latest issue, depending on when this footage is put out on World of Railways. I think that makes sense. But always check prototype pictures. And now she sees service on Little Bytham. Now, to the real purists who really will be wringing their hands and threatening to jump off high buildings, this locomotive, although shedded at York, would not have been seen through Little Bytham until about 1961-62, when the station had been demolished. But Rule 1 applies. Now, with my little bit of work, it didn't take more than a couple of evenings, and some of that was waiting for the paint to dry. I think, at least I hope, this has made a really good layout locomotive. Yes, it was originally on the western region, then the southern region, at the time when Bytham Station was open, but I'm just suggesting that York got it early. It finished at Wakefield and was scrapped, this particular one, the prototype, in 1967, after a ridiculously short life of just 7 years. On a typical working of fast goods, note the horse box. This was very common on such trains, next to the engine, which gave the horse a less bumpy ride. A panning shot. It runs superbly, and I think you can see, if you look really closely, between the middle and fourth driving wheels, in silhouette, I've added the big pipes that carried the sand from the boxes to the pipes. That's never been fitted on an RTR locomotive, and I think it's really an omission. Maybe only in silhouette, but these were called Spaceships because there's a lot of space between the boiler and the top of the frames, and these two dominant pipes were, well, dominant, very evident, worth putting on. It's just thick brass wire. Right, enough of my waffle. Let's see this lovely engine at source, running. And here she goes, setting off at a wonderful crawl. The control is really good. It's slow running, it's sweet, it's smooth, it's not noisy. It's brilliant. And here she is on this typical express goods, heavy, long distance, just the sort of job that the 9Fs were designed for. It really is effortless. It's as powerful as any kit-built equivalent I've made. It's a wonderful model. I thoroughly recommend it. I rather like these panning shots. I do my best, hand holding the camera, but sometimes a little bit of jerk. But my good mate Chris Walsh, his genius at editing, takes out most of the joggles and wobbles and wibbles and what have you. It's so redolent of that early 1960s period when the 9Fs were really doing the most of their work. Criminally short lives, though. So, what are the alternatives? Some may quite rightly say, what's the point? You don't need an alternative. The latest Hornby 9F is as good as it gets. But that's only recently, remember. So let's have a look. Maybe one or two 9Fs from the past. Now this one was made by my elder son Tom when he was 15. Now he's not a genius, but he watched what I was doing and copied a little bit. Not too much, because a lot of what I did wasn't very good anyway. But I handed him over this model. It was an old Kitmaster Evening Star and a set of crown line frames and crown line valve gear and a Dave Alexander tender. And he put it all together. Now, I'm not claiming that he did everything. One of the jobs that one has to do is carve off the moulded handrails. Now, although I don't particularly like children, even my own, I thought at 15 it would be a bit much to have him bleed to death. So I carved off the handrails and he fitted the wire ones. I built one side of the valve gear, I can't remember which side, and he built the other after watching me. He built the tender, put most of the rest together, painted it and weathered it. Now, although it's showing its age, I mean, he's now 45. So my maths suggest that this is 30 years old. But it's still an acceptable layout Loco. And, as you'll shortly see, it runs beautifully. You saw the previous 9F on an express goods with the correct lamps. Now we have an unfitted full minerals, and Tom's Loco is displaying the correct lamps as well. The power behind this locomotive is a Comet gearbox and a Mishima motor, and at 30 years old it's still going strong. I'm certainly not contemplating replacing it. It's good enough. I wonder if anybody else will, say, take the Dapol Kitmaster model, ex-Kitmaster model, well, in fact, Dapol Airfix Kitmaster model, and do this kind of thing now. At the time, remember, tender drive was the 9F way to go. It was a much better solution. I'd like to think, though, that somebody else might attempt this kind of thing. At 15, it'd be lovely to see, wouldn't it? I think what pleases me more than anything else with my finished little Bytham now, although if you look at the buffer stop, that's a Pico one, I've actually got a set of Lanarkshire models, proper Great Northern buffer stops to replace them with. So next time you see a video, let's hope that's been done. But as I say, what pleases me is in 32 feet of little Bytham, I can get the impression of a long length of main line, a length which can accommodate full-length trains. Another alternative for a 9F, years ago, at least 30 years ago, was provided by Model Loco. Now this was a firm in Carlisle who offered high-quality kits. The kits themselves were actually made by DJH for Model Loco. And I got one. And this is about a decade ago. I went back to my hometown of Chester, and in the model shop there, an excellent model shop in Bridge Street Row, they had this kit. It was a bit dusty. It shows how kits are no longer as popular as they were. Anyway, at a very, very good price, I bought it, and I made it into 92141. I painted it, and Jeff Haynes weathered it. The power behind this one is a DJH AM9 motor gearbox combination, mounted vertically and driving off the fourth axle, so it's totally hidden in the firebox. Can't be seen, even in silhouette. And the drive is equally good. It's very smooth, it's very sweet, it's very powerful. You can pick these model Loco kits up unmade for a reasonable price, as I did. As the kit market sort of diminishes and loses its, I suppose, necessity, many kits are coming on the market now at, as I say, very, very good prices. If you still want to build a 9F, that is, it's up to you. My preference is still to build, but I have to say, in comparison with the latest Hornby 9F that's featured, or has featured just before, this is certainly no better. It's no more accurate, it's no more powerful, it's not quieter, it's not smoother. So you have to say, why? Well, I suppose if people ask that question, they don't understand fully the mind of the Loco builder. Now, what about an alternative in the form of RTR? And here we have Bachmann's 9F, the first one, with a 1F tender, which makes it appropriate for the eastern region. I have to say, I don't think this is inferior to the Hornby one. I suppose if one were being analytical, you can find elements of this which are better than the Hornby one and elements of this which are worse, are qualified worse, because there's nothing worst about this. You have a choice of two, RTR, Hornby or Bachmann. That choice is yours. When this Bachmann version came out, this was the one to go for, because the Hornby one, as you've seen earlier, the contemporary Hornby one was poor. So this one just blew it out of the water. It's not the same now. You have a choice, as I say. I have both, and I like both. They both have equal merit. And here she goes on a northbound fitted freight. Equally as powerful as the Hornby one, and perhaps in different ways, equally detailed. All I've done with this one is to weather it slightly. Little bit of detail. I didn't alter its identity, I just kept it as it was, and just light weathering. This locomotive isn't very old. Well, the depiction isn't very old. The real locomotive in 1958 would just be maybe a year old. It's equally as powerful as the Hornby one, it's equally as smooth, it's equally well-running as anything else I've made. And they all fit in, all these different 9Fs, all complement each other. I thought they were wonderful engines as a train spotter. I suppose Evening Star, when I saw Evening Star, that was the icing on the cake, a namer. But she was a bit shabby. She was at Pontypool Road, stored. But it was a cop. This is a DJH 9F. One that I bought as a kit and built. But I wasn't particularly happy with the 1F tender. I don't think the DJH 1F tender is as good as the Dave Alexander one, and certainly not the Bachmann one. So what I've done here is build this DJH example and fit a Bachmann tender. And here she is, at speed. This one has a Comet gearbox, which is ever so slightly visible above that fourth driving wheel, but not too bad. and a cannon motor. A beautiful combination. And note in this particular example, it's been shopped at Darlington, which means it's got the 10-inch cab side numbers. Just a little detail. You can't have too much prototype information. And here we have a perfect prototype at a perfect prototype location. I would think that if the photographer had moved his camera a few degrees to the left, you'd find me, my brother, and my cousins sitting on the wall at Retford. And here we have 92037, a New England 9F on a fitted freight, just crossed over the flat crossing and heading north, in typical 9F grime. And I have a model of 92037. I didn't build this one, I acquired it. I don't know who built it, but it was painted by Larry Goddard. A bit glossy, beautifully painted, but a bit glossy. So I asked my good friend, Jeff Haynes, if he'd weather it, and this is the result. And the tender? The cutout at the rear is a little bit too deep, but I've left it. Now, we saw the prototype of this engine on a fully fitted goods, but here's another typical 9F working, a down empties. The other two trains we saw, or actually the same train, the full minerals, was going south. Anything going north would be empty wagons heading for the Notts coalfield to be replenished at a time when coal was king. We didn't have central heating. Most homes were coal-fired. This is very smooth. This one has a Porter-Scat motor, which has a slight whine, but it's still very, very smooth indeed. A very pleasing engine. I'm lucky to own it. Quite a long train, easily handled by a 9F. I think there are about 40 odd wagons on that, maybe 50. As it goes by, try and count them. Depends how sad the spectator is. More driving wheels than any other British locomotive, apart from the Austerity 210. And the Garretts, of course. Now then, let's finish with the modified Hornby 9F and a couple of the other 9Fs that we've seen. What I did with this one, the Hornby 9F, obviously the last time you saw it, it was hauling an express goods, is put it onto this empty minerals. And I loaded the train up to over 60 wagons, and it didn't even slip. I could have added another dozen, 20, 30 even, but I haven't got that many empty wagons. So I settled on 60 odd, maybe 70, I didn't really count myself. But it takes it effortlessly. And we'll have a little bit of train movement here. She arrives at the down slow home signal and waits. Waits for one of her sisters in the form of the Bachmann 9F you saw earlier, bowling by on a down past goods. The 9Fs here really do complement each other. And the peg goes. and the peg goes off from slow to fast. That wouldn't be very common, but I think this makes a nice juxtaposition. So here we have the Hornby 9F getting its train underway, being passed by Tom's 9F bowling southwards. Sometimes crews would exchange at Little Bytham, and they'd run across the crossing and jump into each other's locomotives, but not on this occasion. You can see to the right that down empty train just keeps on going and going and going. As I say, I just ran out of empty mineral wagons. I hope you've not fallen asleep by now, but it does show the prowess of this latest Hornby 9F. I thoroughly recommend it. And here we've got the still to finish. Once again, thanks to my dear friend Chris Walsh for editing this, and for the Model Centre for donating the locomotive, and to BRM for publishing my article. I hope you enjoyed this footage. Thank you.